So SOZIN, the Fire Lord who betrayed his best friend, the Fire Lord who committed mass genocide on an entire nation, the guy who began a war that would last 100 years, was a bit of an idiot, for multiple reasons, but none more stupid than the one I'll be discussing in this video. You see, SOZIN became the Fire Lord at the age of 24, and in his youth he was best friends with the avatar of that time, Roku. But SOZIN had an incredible itch that needed to be scratched, a desire that he needed fulfilled. He wanted the Fire Nation to become the only nation. He believed that fire was the dominant element and the rightful rulers of the world. Now, as we all know, fire is by far the weakest element in Avatar, and by him even believing this, it just shows a hint of stupidity on his side. But we're not here to discuss the strongest or weakest elements. We'll save that for another video. We are actually here to discuss the genocide and how something that followed highlights the sheer stupidity of the Fire Lord responsible for that 100-year-long war. You see, for the longest time, many, including myself, speculated on just how the Fire Nation even managed to reach the air temples in the first place. Like, sure, the temples in the west were below land, and one could simply just start climbing down a rope or a ladder of some kind just to reach them. But the ones where Aang came from in the east are way above the clouds atop massive mountaintops. Like Aang himself stated that without a bison or the lost ability to fly, no one can actually reach them. So the question actually began to circulate within the community about just how the Firebenders even did this. How did they climb atop those massive mountains and still maintain enough energy to wipe out an entire group of master airbenders? It doesn't seem possible. Well, that's where some of the community started to come out of the shadows and claim that it was the airships that the Fire Nation had used to carry supplies and reinforcements. But this was obviously debunked almost instantly because the airships never existed over 100 years ago. Like, they of course were made by the Mechanist and Sokka, two people who weren't even born yet. So if not by use of the airships, then how could they have possibly reached the air temples? Well, we actually have two options for this, and honestly, despite how the live action showed one of these examples in episode 1, I'd like to discuss how that seems very unlikely to me as a fan of the show. You see, the first option is as we've seen in the live action, the ability to shoot large amounts of fire underneath oneself to then propel themselves upwards, an ability that was also seen used by Azula a number of times in the cartoon. This ability to me and many in the community always seemed a bit advanced and hard to imagine just any soldier doing, or at the very least doing well. Like, sure, one could argue that because they had the comet on their side that they of course had the power to do this, but to do it well enough that no one died in the process is another story. But just for argument's sake, let's say that the Fire Nation did possess this ability and even the most average of benders were able to utilize it in combat. Then why was the wall of Ba Sing Se so impossible to penetrate? Like, in my opinion, if you have the means to essentially fly over massive mountains in what appears to be a couple of minutes, then you of course should have the means to scale a wall the size of a 4-story building. At most, you could say that they didn't have the comet to aid them like they did against the airbenders, so that's why they didn't fly over the walls and annihilate the earthbenders. But that didn't actually seem to stop them from attacking the walls in the first place. Like, let's just imagine that they did penetrate the walls. Would they have then taken that as a win and left for the day, or would they have attacked with everything they had in the attempt to wipe out the earthbenders like they did with the airbenders? Of course they'd attack. All the firebenders know is attack. They've never really heard of retreating. And not to mention, if they did retreat, then the likes of SOZIN or Ozai would have had their heads first. Like, they really don't like losing. Like, if I'm being honest, this live action canon moment seems like a bit of a plot hole to me. It just really doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, if they actually had this power and any firebender could use it whenever they saw fit, then we would have most definitely saw a lot more aerial combat in the series. But we didn't. And honestly, given the many other things that the live action fucked up or just cut out, it makes me think that this means of reaching the air temples is just another bullshit thing that the live action had that the original cartoon didn't. Like, I and many of the community have always had a different idea for what the Fire Nation used to reach the air temples. A means that we only see a few times in the series, and a very powerful means that SOZIN himself very stupidly destroyed. It's the dragons. You see, we find out throughout the series from Zuko and others that the dragons were the original firebenders, and at one point they were everywhere in the Fire Nation. They wore to the firebenders what the bisons wore to the airbenders. They were a lifelong companion that you could use to traverse the world. But these beautiful and powerful creatures would soon go from friend to foe. You see, it was revealed by Zuko that the Fire Lord SOZIN would later go hunting the dragons as a means of proving your superior firebending power. It is said that if you could find and kill one of them, then you would be classified as a true master. So understandably, over time, with countless firebenders hunting down these poor creatures, they would soon be wiped off the face of the earth. And personally, I believe this to be one of the most stupid decisions that has ever been made by any Fire Lord or even any character in the entire series. Because think about it, it is mine and many of the fans believe that the attack on the air temples was only done by the aid of the dragons. We believe that the soldiers were flown to the top of the mountains and dropped off. Because remember, they were said to be everywhere around this time period, and they were large enough to carry a few hundred soldiers without any trouble. So they would have been the most obvious and logical option for the firebenders when they wanted to attack the air temples. Though it should also be noted that many do believe that the dragons themselves never actually attacked the airbenders, because they are spiritual animals and the original firebenders. So them attacking the airbenders would have been aiding in the imbalancement of the world elements, something the spiritual animals would want no part in. It is far more likely and believed that the dragons were more or less just a means of transport for the Fire Nation soldiers. They simply carried them to the top of the mountain and just let them do their thing. Now this would also mean that the Fire Nation had complete aerial control. And a brief history lesson for you all, during World War II, it is said that the pushback of the Nazi forces came shortly after the Allied forces gained complete aerial control. You see, with countless bombings coming from the air, the Germans were left borderline powerless and with no real options, so they were forced to submit. So taking this into the world of Avatar, the Fire Nation would have utilized the dragons in near the same way. They would have unleashed countless powerful aerial attacks on both the Northern Water Tribe and Earth Kingdoms. And with both nations having no real way to counter this or fight back, they would have most definitely been wiped out in just a couple of years. So this is what leads me to why SOZIN is one of the stupidest characters in the entire series. Because by destroying the dragons, he subsequently destroyed his greatest asset in the war against the world. A war he most desperately wanted to win. So now the only question that remains is, why would he actually do this? Why would he cut off his nose to despite his face? Well, it has never really been stated in the series, but it can only be one of two reasons. One, he really did go insane and, like the Mad King in Game of Thrones, decided to act on his insanity by doing something so stupid that it would eventually bring about his own demise. Or two, he feared that the dragons would one day train the Avatar to firebend, which oddly enough did actually happen in the original series. It was out of this fear that he decided that the loss of the incredible power was worth it, because it would mean that the Avatar could never complete his training. And as we all know, the Avatar needs to master all four elements to restore the balance in the world. So as much as I understand this reasoning and do slightly agree with it to some extent, it is still considerably one of the most stupid things to do in the entire series. Because it ultimately means that for some god knows reason, he believes his soldiers could never change sides. He believed that his army was so loyal that no one would ever switch sides and train the Avatar to use firebending. He believed the only option the Avatar would have had is the dragons. Which honestly makes the fact that the Avatar was trained by his own grandson Zuko so much more fitting for the story. Like in his many attempts to keep the Avatar from learning firebending, he pushed his own family members in the direction that would lead them to training him. Like, is it just me that thinks that's an incredible coincidence? But I'm getting slightly off topic. In conclusion, SOZIN used the dragons to reach the air temple and kill the air nomads, then stupidly decided to kill them so as to keep Aang from learning firebending. But by doing this, he made the most stupidest decision in the entire series. Because if he simply utilized the dragons, he could have ended the war in a couple of years. But don't take my word for it. You tell me in the comments, what do you actually think? Is my reasoning sound? Did the Fire Nation use the dragons to reach the air temples, or was the live actions display of firebending the actual way it went down? Tell me down below. But with that, I'm out. Have a great rest of your day, and peace.